Well, coming up on today's show, at least what I originally planned for, is PFF's most underrated player for the Cleveland Browns. Bleacher Report came out with 3 realistic free agent targets. But right before we started our live show today, which we are filming today's episode inside of our live Cleveland Browns report, the Browns made a handful of roster moves. So let's break down those roster moves super duper quickly here. As Mary Kay Cabot reported, the Browns claimed tackle, Kellen Diesch, and via waivers, and signed wide receiver Jalen Camp, and then they waived kicker Luke Harvjic. Remember, they had Cade York and, of course, the better D-Hop, so they already had 3 kickers. They didn't need all 3. So let's give some background here on both of these players. We'll start with Camp. He was a draft pick out of Georgia Tech by the Jags in the 6th round back in 2021. He appeared in 5 games last year, started one of them, all actually in Houston with the Texans. And then last year, he bounced around between the Steelers and Panthers practice squad. Meanwhile, Kellen Diesch, he was a UDFA out of Arizona State on the offensive line. And he was originally with Miami as a UDFA in 2022. And then last year, he was on the Bears and Steelers practice squad. So those are the 2 roster additions that were made. And then to make some room, we've got a kicker when you don't really need 3 kickers, let alone 2 most times, being waived to open up some roster spots. So my analysis of this is these are just camp bodies, right? These are just guys that are going to come in and compete. And hey, a lot of times we give these players like 30 to 45 seconds of our time. And most of the time, that's really all they need because they are so, rotated in and out throughout the offseason. But every once in a while, you get yourself an Austin Watkins. Remember, he was like the last guy added before training camp last year. And then he was like the star of training camp for the Browns. So that was super fun. So, it's worth memorizing these names at least for a few days or weeks before inevitably these guys get rotated in and out and you forget all about them. Now, let's talk about PFF's most underrated player. And that is Maurice Hurst. So, he comes off a really strong season for the Browns where he had career best in games played, tackles for loss, sacks, pass breakups, interceptions, and snaps since his 2nd season in the league back in 2019 with the Oakland Raiders. Now, he re-signed with the Browns, if you've been living under a rock, on a 1-year, $3.2 million contract, which, when you think about the Browns' 3 free agent defensive tackles, Jordan Elliott, Shelby Harris, and Maurice Hurst, I thought Maurice Hurst was the best of all 3 of those guys last year. And he ends up being the lowest paid out of all 3 of those guys in free agency. I could not agree more, though, with what Pro Football Focus is saying here about Maurice Hurst being the most underrated player on this Browns team. Is he someone that other fan bases know and fear when they go up against the Browns? Probably not. Is he someone that after the game is over, they go, who the hell is that guy rubbing his belly all game long? Probably, because he did a whole lot last year. 22 tackles, 1.5 sacks, 4 tackles for loss. And keep in mind, he did all of this in just 13 games before unfortunately suffering a season-ending pec injury. Now, here's what PFF had to say on Maurice Hurst. Although his season was cut short due to an injury, Maurice Hurst was playing the best football of his career in his 6th NFL campaign in 2023. In fact, after the first 8 weeks of the season, Hurst ranked 7th among interior defenders in PFF overall grade. Admittedly, he was used as a role player in Jim Schwartz's defense, but he was very efficient in that reduced role. So here are the PFF grades, by the way, for Maurice Hurst from 2023. Overall grade of 81. That ranked 13th out of 130 qualifying defensive tackles. Stout against the run. Good pass rush upside as well. Felt like he was always getting his big paws up in the air and batting passes down. Him and Shelby Harris were so good at that last year. So I'm very excited for Maurice Hurst to come back. Another thing about him that I don't think you can just illustrate in a YouTube video is the personality. The guy's funny. The locker room loves him. And you need those guys. You need those cultures, tone setters in a locker room. And Maurice Hurst, in my eyes, is one of those players. So he ultimately will probably not be someone that rises the Cleveland Browns leaderboard and goes down as one of the best Browns defensive players of all time. But I think he's going to be a really solid player for this team. He'll be a key part of that rotation on the defensive line. And most importantly, In a few years, he's going to make one hell of a random Browns player. So name a random Browns player for me down below. The more random, the better. I don't want to see any basic names. I don't want to see Baker. I don't want to see any of that. I want deep cuts. I want Miles Austins of the world. Now, next up on the show, we're going to look at some realistic free agent targets for the Browns. Bleacher Report came out with an article following the draft of, hey, these teams could target these players. And I thought I would share with you guys what the folks at Bleacher Report had to say. But first, I do want to fill everyone in about our sponsor today, which is Prize Picks. That is daily fantasy made easy, where all you've got to do is pick 2 to 6 players and then choose more or less on their projected stats. So as you watch the NBA and the NHL playoffs, and if you're looking to have some extra fun while watching games that the Cavs aren't playing in, say the really exciting series between the Nuggets and the T-Wolves, I mean, I'm going with the more on Nikola Jokic's points, rebounds, and assists combined at 50.5, taking the less on Cat's points at 19.5. And then Obi Toppin and the Pacers, they have just walked all over the Knicks the last 2 games. So I'll take the more on Obi Toppin at 8.5 points. So if you like my selections and you want to ride with me, download the Prize Picks app today and use code CLNS for a first-time deposit match up to $100. Don't worry, I put all that information for you guys in the comments and description of today's video. But download the app today and use code CLNS for a first-time deposit match up to $100. Now, let's talk about some free agent targets, realistic ones too, although there's not that many big sexy names out in the street anymore. Some really good safeties, and that's kind of about it at this stage. But here were the 3 players that Bleacher Report targeted for Cleveland. Linebacker Kwon Alexander, cornerback Ahkello Witherspoon, and defensive end edge rusher Yannick Ngakoue, who has just lived out of a suitcase, as I like to say, throughout his entire NFL career. But let's kind of go in order here, starting with Alexander. He's hopped around. He was with the Jets last. He was with the Saints before that. He was with the 49ers before that. He's had some good seasons. He's struggled staying on the field, like last year only playing in 9 games, but he can make some impact plays for you. 7 tackles for loss, 6 tackles for loss, 2 interceptions sprinkled in, some pass breakups, and ultimately I think the Browns are likely content with their linebacker room. Keyword is content. Do they love it? I wouldn't if I were them, but also you can only do so much in one offseason, and ultimately they decided the linebacker position this year is just not going to be a spot that gets a lot of resources allocated to it. They signed Jordan Hicks. They signed Devin Bush. They like to run 2 linebacker sets, an extra safety on the field. So it's going to be a lot of JOK and Hicks with Devin Bush sprinkled in when they get towards the goal line. And I think Jim Schwartz is okay with that. But maybe during OTAs and training camp, they decide we want to bring in an extra body. Ahkello Witherspoon. So he was someone that really struggled staying on the field with the Pittsburgh Steelers for a good stretch of time. But last year with the Rams puts together a 17-game season, and the best one ever, too, like in his career. 52 tackles, 3 tackles for loss, 14 pass breakups, and 3 interceptions. So I thought Witherspoon played outstanding last year, and I could see the Browns looking at cornerback and edge rusher as cornerstone pieces, where they can feel like they never have enough depth at those spots. So maybe they look at Witherspoon as, hey, a really good player, but more importantly, a guy that we could just use for depth at the cornerback position because we've got our top 3 in Denzel Ward, Greg Newsome, Martin Emerson. But if one of those guys goes down, what's the confidence level in a Khalifa Hasse or a Cam Mitchell, a Vincent Gray? Maybe not as high as Witherspoon. Now, does Witherspoon want to come to a spot where he'll be a backup? That might take some convincing. But at this point of free agency, he may not have a lot of options. As for the defensive line for Yannick Ngakoue, a lot of what I said for Witherspoon goes for Ngakoue, where we know Andrew Berry likes to target cornerstone pieces, right? He signed Okoronkwo last year in free agency, and then he trades for Zadarius Smith. So, and that was, by the way, right after drafting Isaiah McGuire. So the guy added 3 edge rushers last year in like a 6-week span, give or take. So maybe he looks at Yannick Ngakoue as a really good player that has no business being a free agent still. And if his price drops, they feel like more the merrier when it comes to edge rushers. Last year, he had 4 sacks for Chicago. He broke his ankle towards the end of the year after playing 13 games, but there's videos out of him running around, and ankle looks fine to me, so I think he's ready to play again. But maybe Andrew Berry feels like, hey, we can never have enough good corners and edge rushers, and if there's quality guys still on the street, well, we're just doing a bad job by not at least looking at them. So I think if the Browns were to make another signing, at least a big-ish one, it would be at a cornerstone position where the Browns feel like, let's lock and load at those spots because we don't want to go through our top guys and not have good reserves at those positions. Now, what position do you think the Browns should add to? Get in the comment section below and let me know. For me, I would say corner actually may be one that grows on me just because Denzel Ward and Greg Newsome do have a pattern of missing time. So the last thing you want to see happen is you're down your top 2 corners and the backups aren't living up to the expectations and you find yourself in a jam. So cornerback is definitely a good spot to lock and load at and have plenty of depth at. Now, we'll bring producer Trace on to pick a card to wrap up the show. Trace, which card do you want to go with?
I'm going to roll with the 7 of diamonds.
7 of diamonds. Give me the 3 of clubs.
How you feeling? Lucky?
No. Some guy always comments a different card, but it's not this one. 8 of clubs.
Damn.
8 of clubs. All right. That will do it for us on today's episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already. That way you can come hang out with us tomorrow, or maybe when you're watching this today, when the NFL schedule is released, and we'll go game by game for the Cleveland Browns.